Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the British School at Rome. Both those of you with us at the BSR this evening and those of you online. It gives me great pleasure this evening to introduce tonight's speaker, dear friend Enrico Giorgi. He's a professor of archaeology, of landscape and urban archaeology at University of Bologna, president of the Centro Studi Archeologia dell'Adriatico, editor del e-journal Groma. Enrico himself graduated from Bologna in 1997 with a thesis on landscape archaeology, later completing his doctoral thesis with a joint degree from University of Padova, Bologna, and Rome La Sapienza. Shortly after, he became responsible for the topography lab at Bologna, becoming an associate professor in 2015. Enrico has an impressive number of publications. I lost count after 200, so I think there's quite a few there to read afterwards. But it's a testimony to the vast number of projects and excavations that he has led, including at Pompeii, Picenum, and Agrigento. He currently directs research projects in the Adriatic Ionian area, such as those at Butrint, Monte Rinaldo, and the latter of which he will talk about this evening. I had the great pleasure to introduce Enrico back in 2015 and gladly accepted the opportunity for the BSR to collaborate with him on a new research project at Monte Rinaldo. It gives me also great pleasure to welcome the Mayor of Monte Rinaldo this evening to the BSR, Gianmario Borini, and thank him for the support of the project and the BSR, and as well as the regional superintendenza, who I believe are following us online this evening, for their support as well. So therefore, I'm delighted to invite Enrico this evening to the BSR, and extremely happy he accepted our invitation with a lecture entitled Beyond the Colonies, the Roman Sanctuary of Monte Rinaldo and the Roman Conquest of the Mid-Adriatic area. Enrico.
So, many thanks, Stephen. And I would like, before beginning, to thank all the colleagues of the British School at Rome for giving me this occasion to share with you the results of our project in Monte Rinaldo. And so I'm going to read, forgive me, but I hope to stay on time reading it. And so really, I have to begin with this. Maybe it's strange. Because I would like to ask you, I'm sure that if I could ask you your idea about Roman archaeology, if I could ask you the first ideas that you have you can find in your mind, probably are the pictures, something about Colosseum or Roman Forum, paved roads such as the Appia, for example, or shortly after maybe Pompeii. And this is, I think, our idea of Roman archaeology. This is mine, maybe, because the idea of ancient Rome is about towns, about paved roads, about link roads between these towns. But this is not the only archaeology that you can find, and so we are going to speak about this. So when we think of ancient Rome, the immediate thought our mind goes to are probably the monuments that survived almost intact from the past. But Googling Roman archaeology, the first images that appear are views of the Colosseum, the Roman Forum, and Pompeii. Actually, Roman cities and roads seems to be the most visible outcome of Roman conquest, even in the mid-Adriatic area, which corresponds to the modern-day Marche region, formerly separated between ager Gallicus to the north and the Picenum to the south. This is the so-called territory of the 35 cities, at least in Augustan age, linked by a network of roads that branched off from the two main Roman roads of the region, which were the Via Salaria and the Via Flaminia. But this marked the conclusion of a 3-century-long phenomenon. Prior to this, Cities were virtually non-existent and emerged from north to south as a long-term consequence of the Roman conquest. After the conquest in the 3rd century BC, only 3 colonies were founded. The Latin colony of Ariminum at the mouth of the Po Valley, still inhabited by Gauls, the Roman colony of Sena Gallica in the center of the Middle Adriatic here, the Middle Adriatic coast, and the Latin colony of Firmum in the heart of Picenum. The Picenian city of Asculum and the harbor of Ancona became towns allied with Rome and were subject to an agreement defending part of their autonomy, even though within the political system dominated by Rome. Thanks to the Lex Flaminia, a colony were sent in the region Viritim, which means giving each of them plots of land in areas without new cities. So much of the conquered territory was settled by Romans in villages and farms scattered among the surrounding valleys and hills with no other towns. We can get an idea of the impact of the Roman settlement by looking at the map of archaeological sites in Cesano River Valley, inland from Sena Gallica, where rural sites increase from here to there, increase about 10 times after the conquest. The central place in this territory was the settlement of Suasa, located in the middle of the valley along a pre-Roman route on the right bank of the river before the construction of the branch of the Via Flaminia on the opposite bank. But there were also other villages, such as the one found at Santa Maria in Portuno. During this period, the landscape was organized with plots of land for agriculture and for pasture demonstrated by paleo-environmental analysis. Some of the settlement usually developed where node crossroads favored their topographical location and became marketplace and administrative centers. Among the villages of the Cesano River Valley, Suasa had a particularly propitious topographical location and became the center of a district for the administration of justice called Prefectura, used by the prefectus for trials. Indeed, the Roman settlement developed along a route that allowed people to cross the river even in the earlier age, when this road was overseen by the fortified site of Miralbello, discovered through geophysical prospection and aerial photography. The excellent state of preservation buildings of the Imperial Age has allowed for excavation within offcuts in their floors. Nevertheless, we have managed to bring back to light an early building phase in different parts of the city, characterized by structures with pebbles foundation and clay walls. Of great interest is the picture emerging from the study of material culture of this period as well. Black gloss pottery was imported from the Tyrrhenian area and locally produced, and it was used alongside local impasto ware of a pre-Roman tradition. The most significant find from this period is a black gloss cup with the Latin alphabet engraved, which may include a characteristic letter of the Celtic alphabet, testifying about the survival of people belonging to the pre-Roman substratum, in spite of the slaughter of the Senon Gauls, as recounted by Polybius. In the light of archaeological research, early inhabitants of Suasa seem to have been a mixed community, where different cultures lived together in town and in the territory for all the 3rd century BC. In any case, the topographical location and the role of Prefectura favored its urban development during the 2nd century BC. In this period, we can see an economic expansion and an urban development as a result of military conquest on the other side of the Adriatic Sea that involved important families and many soldiers from this territory. And this is precisely in this period that also Suasa is provided with sacred buildings and houses suitable for the standard of living of the new local elite. During the 2nd century BC, the settlement took an urban form, Atrium houses and the sacred area were built on both sides of the main street. And the house of the first style had a Tuscanic atrium and was decorated with paintings and floors similar to the ones of the most important families in Pompeii. The sacred area seemed almost a smaller version of more famous examples, such as that of Largo Argentina in Rome. During the Augustan period and in the mid-imperial age, the city experienced a significant urban development with the construction of several public buildings, such as the theater, the amphitheater, and a large commercial forum with an Augusteum. The great domus of the Coiedi, with its large garden, was built in this period as well, in front of the forum, and then it was converted to a public building used by Augustales. Nevertheless, its urban shape was still that of a large village, with a few houses and large public buildings, used even by those citizens who lived in the several rural settlements scattered throughout the territory. This perhaps explains why, even in the imperial period, Suasa had a commercial forum and an amphitheater out of proportion with the small size of the town, and did not have walls or even buildings such as the basilica, which normally characterize Roman cities. It is likely that the Domus de Coiedi, a large domus with mosaics and marble floors, performed the public functions necessary for the life of the town. So the story of Suasa is emblematic of these Adriatic settlements that took on a city status without even having its shape, but that represented the necessary answer to the organization of the landscape wanted by Rome, which were subsequently abandoned and at the end of the antiquity when the historical and environmental conditions had changed. However, the city was not the only solution, and particularly in the first 2 centuries after the conquest, other alternative options were also tested. Among these are rural sanctuaries, such as that of Monte Rinaldo, where joint research by the University of Bologna and the British School at Rome, in agreement with the Soprintendenza per le Marche and with the municipality of Monte Rinaldo, has just concluded. The Soprintendenza was represented by Filippo Demma, Paola Mazzieri, and Tommaso Casticeccacci, Francesco Pizzimenti, and now by Francesco Belfiore. The project, supported by the University of Bologna and by the municipality of Monte Rinaldo with Gianmario Borroni as a major, took 7 years between the 2016 and the 2023, and saw archaeologists engaged in surveys in the surrounding area coordinated by Francesco Pizzimenti, geophysical prospection led by Stephen Kay with Elena Pomar, archaeological excavation coordinated by Francesco Belfiore, and the study of finds by Paola Costantino, and now by Anna Gamberini with Letizia Carra for the paleoenvironmental analysis. To all these colleagues and to the many students who grew up within the project, I owe my deepest and the most grateful thanks. Preliminary reports of each excavation campaign are available in the papers of the British School at Rome, and we have already published the first result of the project thanks to the book on legacy data and on the first years of excavation. As the second volume is still in progress, I'm going to give you some preview. Today, the sanctuary of Monte Rinaldo stands along the Aso River on the hill slope bordering the valley, and it is one of the best preserved Roman sacred buildings in the mid-Adriatic area. In the Roman period, the sanctuary was located in the heart of Picenum between the Latin colony of Fermo and the Picenian city of Asculum. This is Fermo and this is Asculum, and Monte Rinaldo is in the middle. This region had not been invaded by Gauls and was still inhabited by Picentes at the time of Roman conquest. Latin authors record that after the conquest, Rome deported part of the population, but entered into a treaty of alliance with Asculum. This explains the early urban development of the Caput Gentis Asculum, which seems attested by some recent archaeological findings on Colle dell'Annunziata, where it is speculated the shrine of the goddess Ancaria might have stood. The ancient Picenian town of Asculum is located in the Tronto Valley along the Via Salaria, a pre-Roman route connecting the Adriatic coast with the Apennine Mountains. The city developed on a plateau dominated by the Annunziata Hill between two sunken watercourses. During the late Republic, between the 2nd and the 1st century BC, the upper part of its plateau was raised by means of substructures similar to those visible at Tivoli or Palestrina, and the temple was decorated with the antefixes of the same type found at Monte Rinaldo. In the valley of the Aso River, between Ascoli and Firmum, the sanctuary of Monte Rinaldo stood at the same time. Otherwise, no other cities are known, and archaeological research has shown that the Picentes lived in small villages and gathered in sanctuaries where community meetings were held, such as the sanctuary of Cupra. Contrary to the assumption of the previous tradition of studies, new research has led to the exclusion of the pre-existence of a Picenian worship at Monte Rinaldo, hypothesized mainly because there is a still active spring, and the site that was linked to curative practices of sanatio. The dating of this hypothetical pre-Roman shrine had been deduced from a few remains of courseware pottery, normally considered typical of Picenian culture. If anything, we are now inclined to believe that the use of water was necessary for cult practices, such as the purification ceremony called lustratio, regardless the curative function, while a critical review is underway of the courseware characterized by a very raw fabric named impastoware. Vases with such characteristics, mainly ole and cups, were produced by Italic peoples, not just the Picentes, and they used long after the arrival of Roman settlers. This leads us to be much more careful in identifying impastoware too simply as a marker of Picenian culture. Moreover, the archaeological excavation of the nearby Picenian sanctuary of Ancaria at Asculum seems to suggest the long-term use over time of traditional pottery used for the cult even after the Roman era. In the case of Monte Rinaldo, there is the possibility that the sanctuary worked as a cult place for surviving Picentes as well. The inclusion of local people may have favored the preservation of traditional objects for the cult even after the arrival of the new settlers. We cannot know whether the Roman settlement of the Aso Valley was merely the consequence of the creation of the nearby Latin colony of Firmum or the arrival of settlers established by the Lex Flaminia, nor can we rule out the possibility that the two waves of settlement overlapped and were in turn reinforced by the Lex Semponia Agraria in the following century. However, we do have a clear evidence of a Tyrrhenian-made black gloss pottery dating to the 3rd century BC. Again, this is a marker often used too far directly to date the early stages of a Roman settlement. This would be pottery that was not produced in Adriatic area, but brought by free settlers, Roman settlers. There are, however, two possibilities that are underestimated by the traditional interpretation. These ceramics could also have arrived as a result of commercial activities with the Latin traders, or have been imported from the colonies that in the meantime had established in the Gallic and Picenian territory. In the case of Monte Rinaldo, these finds are associated with the impastoware and with other types of objects which are difficult to date, but normally considered markers of the arrivals of Romans. These are the votive fictives, the fictive votive offerings, which are terracotta objects and mainly represents part of the body donated to the deity in gratitude for grace received. This practice is completely foreign for Picenian religion, appearing at several sites in the mid-Adriatic area only following the arrival of Romans. Usually, these objects are referred to a place of worship, which may originally be a sacred forest or otherwise a part of a natural landscape that is consecrated but with no buildings. In the mid-Adriatic area, the best-known site is the Lucus Pisaurensis, an open-air sanctuary that was built in the 3rd century BC at the gates of the future colony of Pisaurum, on a hill along the Via Flaminia named Colle della Salute, a name that truly reflects the nature of the place. The site was discovered in the 18th century by a local scholar and is normally reconstructed by archaeologists as a sacred forest that held 14 inscribed sandstone altars and more than 100 votive offerings. The inscription normally recall the deity and the name of those who have made the dedication. The cults of Apollo, Liber, and the college of 9 female deities, including Juno and Mater Matuta, are attested. These were mainly deities who ensured health, especially during the transitional moments in the woman's lives, such as pregnancy, childbirth, and marriage. In the decades leading up to the founding of the nearby colony of Pisaurum, attendance at the rural site became sporadic until it was finally abandoned, as if the aggregation function of this rural sanctuary was disappearing with the flourishing of the urban center. Although there are no such remains, we can assume that an open-air shrine similar to the Lucus Pisaurensis also arose in the same period at Monte Rinaldo, near a spring in the middle Aso Valley, and served as a gathering place for an early community of settlers who lived scattered throughout the surrounding area. As speculated by Francesco Belfiori, among the artifacts is a clay votive offerings representing a roughly made human face that might betray an attempt at imitation by people evidently converted to the cult of the new settlers. This would confirm that the shrine was a place of inclusion for the local inhabitants, perhaps the same ones along with the new settlers, continued to use in Passover for worship. Another find of great interest, still under study, could be interpreted in the same direction, and this is. It's a bronze element in a shape of a moon sickle, used as a coin by Celtic population, which may have been offered along with the fictive votives. And we know that even in the Lucus Pisaurensis, heavy bronze coins called ais grave were offered in the same way. During the following century, the flourishing of Hellenistic architecture, which characterized the whole of the Italic peninsula, also reached the Picenum, where we have evidence of a widespread presence of monumental sanctuaries that, unfortunately, are often testified only by the architectural decoration. At the same time, some important families descending from the conquering generals and directly involved in the founding of the new colonies of Pisarum and Potentia in 184 BC, such as the Fabi and the Fulvi, engaged in acts of euergetism to pay for construction of public building mentioned in some epigraphs. A particularly significant piece of evidence of these republican shrines is represented by the remains of the clay ornament and the pediment found at Civitalba. In the central part of the region, a little further inland than the territory of Suasa that we have seen before. The site is located in a hill plateau overlooking the Sassoferrato Basin, where in 295 BC the Battle of Sentino took place, which saw the defeat of the Gauls and opened the way for Rome to conquer the mid-Adriatic region. The frieze represents the Galathomachi, the war against the Galatian Celtic population, and the pediment replicates the western pediment of the Temple of Apollo at Delphi. They both recall the expulsion of Galatians from the Greek sanctuary but the one of Civitalba refers at the same time to the defeat of the Gauls and celebrate the conquest of their territory by Rome. Scholars believe that patrons of this decorative program were the same families who were engaged in conquest and then in the colonization of this territory. Despite its architectural development, even this Republican sanctuary was abandoned when the Roman city of Sentino was developed. Indeed, we have a little bit of archaeological data on this important site, which has recently been the subject of a preliminary topographical survey and would certainly deserve more attention in the future, possibly by the same team already engaged at Monte Rinaldo. We don't know, maybe. Although there is no such clear evidence, it is possible that something similar also happened in the Middle Aso Valley in the second quarter of the 2nd century BC, when a new temple was built on the site of the previous open-air shrine. We do not know how the enterprise originated, but we can assume that the construction took place thanks to the spoils collected from the wars carried out on the other side of the Adriatic Sea by victorious generals who had their clients in Picenum and were veterans of those battles lead. For example, it is worth mentioning that a troop of soldiers from Fermo contributed to the Roman victory over Macedonians at Pydna in 164 BC, 68, excuse me. In this historical context is set the construction of a temple in the center of a square with a large porch, which served as a scenographic background. In the shape survived until today, the portico had the two naves with a Doric column facing the square and a central spine of Ionian order. Whilst the portico survived in use, the temple was rebuilt after a few decades, perhaps because of static problems due to the instability of the hillside. We can have an idea of its original form thanks to some fragments of its architectural decoration that were ritually used in the later reconstruction. However, this early building phase is marked by extensive remains of burnt animal bones, fruit seeds, and the black gloss pottery used for worship and then offered to the shrine deities. All these remains of earlier frequentation were incorporated into a kind of a sacred feel embedded in the leveling needed to standardize the square in the subsequent building phase. Normally, we know that the offerings could not be taken away from the deity who owned them, so they were periodically buried in a ritual deposit called steep. No such deposit has been found at Monte Rinaldo, but we have to presume that the discovered scattering of ground rich in remains of the sacred offerings was felt as a kind of a large votive deposit spread below the sanctuary. In the second half of the 2nd century BC, the temple was rebuilt and the sanctuary was enriched with other buildings. The new sacred complex survived for several decades before being destroyed again. We do not know the reason for this destruction. It could be because of the natural events such as the seismic activity that affected the Picenum in the first decade of the 1st century BC, or because of the clashes that took place during the Social War, which saw the Roman army based in Fermo pitted against the Picentes from the nearby Asculum. In any case, the sanctuary collapsed, and the remains of the portico with its stone columns were covered by the colluvial soil from the hill above, while the rest of the building material was reused several decades later to construct a rural building dated to the triumviral Augustan period. The collapse of the portico was discovered in the last 1950s, following some agricultural work that led to the intervention of the Superintendenza, and then to the excavation and reconstruction of the portico. In the following decades, new research took place on several occasions until our systematic research project began in 2016. Thanks to the reconstruction of the portico, the remains of the foundation of the other buildings brought to light by the new excavation, and to the laborious work of piecing together the architectural decoration from the old and new excavation, we now have a pretty clear understanding of its architectural form. The sanctuary was composed of a square enclosed at the rear by a portico, which I have already described, but now closed on its sides by a further portico with brick pillars on the east and another building to the west. The center of the square was occupied by a tetra-style temple of Tuscanic type, with a central cella and a two-side room called ale. To the left of the temple stood a minor sacellum where water from the spring was collected into a basin. Due to this storing method, the water needed for purification ceremonies was always available. Thanks to the discovery of several black glass cups with the name of the deity to whom they were offered, we finally know that the main temple was dedicated to Jupiter. The cups found have shapes typically used for the consumption and the offering of wine, while the inscriptions are of two types. Regarding the wine, widely used on many occasions for libations, it may be interesting to recall that the celebration of Vinalia was an occasion in Roman calendar involving the offering to Jupiter of the first wine of the season. About the inscription, in some cases, the dedication was engraved on the bottom of the cup that was offered to the deity after libation. In other cases, the vessels already carried the printed name of the deity on the bottom before firing. This means that such pottery was produced on site, specifically for the worship of Jupiter. Some of the figures represented a bearded man could portray Jupiter. However, in absence of specific attributes, a certain identification is not possible. Some clay lamps showing a lightning bolt, on the other hand, help us better understand the attributes of the main deity, possibly worshipped in the form of Jupiter Fulgor. Decorations were also recognized representing the mistress of wild animals called Potniateron, which could also record the presence of a female-related cult. A further deity worshipped at Monte Rinaldo must have been Hercules, portrayed in a statue and in a fragment of architectural decoration with the characteristic headdress obtained from the lion's head called Leonte. Confirmation of the presence of Hercules in the pantheon of Monte Rinaldo also comes from a black gloss cup engraved with the initial letter of his name. The cult of Hercules, as the symbol of civilization against barbarism, was very popular among Roman settlers and, as the protector of transhumant shepherds, was particularly widespread in these regions based on pastoral economy. The small size of the statue of Hercules compared to those in the pediment of the main temple can be interpreted in two ways. The first possibility is that it was part of a more articulated composition with the figures of different sizes. The second possibility is that it was placed in a smaller shrine dedicated to Hercules that can be identified with the building erected to the left of the main temple. We have already referred to the statues that were part of the temple remains. This includes a female portrait that some scholars have identified as a muse. Although no attributes are present to clearly identify her, so we are not sure. If this is the case, the statue could be linked to the cult of Hercules Musarum, which had been brought to Rome after the conquest of the Epirus city of Ambracia in northwestern Greece at the beginning of the 2nd century BC. According to some scholars, it may have been the victorious general himself or someone in his circle who was behind the construction of the sanctuary at Monte Rinaldo and Civitalba. The pantheon of deities worshipped at Monte Rinaldo was completed by Apollo and Vesta, whose initial letters were engraved on other black gloss cups found in the sanctuary. The architecture of the sanctuary was completed on the eastern side by a second smaller portico with brick pillars and a sequence of small commercial rooms called taverne. Thanks to the excavation completed in 2023, we know that the western side of the square was instead occupied by a building whose function is still being studied, but which can be assumed to have served the sanctuary itself. In the excavation of this building, we found the remains of a ritual deposit with a cup and burned animal bones in a circular pit set against the foundation. Other similar ritual deposits were also recognized by reinterpreting the documentation of all the excavations in the main portico and eastern taverne. From an architectural point of view, the sanctuary of Monte Rinaldo seemed to be inspired by other well-known buildings in the Latium area, such as the Temple of Juno at Gabi or the Temple of Hercules at Tivoli, which in turn depends on models of Hellenistic origin, widespread in Greece. The sanctuary survived the news with a few reconstructions until about the middle of the 1st century BC, before it fell completely into ruin. The final building phases also included the rebuilding of the ends of the main portico in the form of rectangular exedras with 3 Ionic columns. We do not know what the exact function of these exedras was, but we can assume that, together with the rest of the large portico, they served as multifunctional spaces for the life of the community gathered around the sanctuary during a religious ceremony, but also civil and economic activities. It cannot be ruled out that Monte Rinaldo was the place where, in the Republican age, the prefect went to administer justice, perhaps using the portico itself and its exedras as a tribunal. In addition, the small stores along the eastern porch show that this was also a marketplace, perhaps functional to the sale of pottery produced on the site, such as cups with a Jupiter stamp. The link to livestock farming, which was also necessary for sacrifices in the sanctuary itself, seem to be demonstrated by surveys in the surrounding area that show a landscape probably used for grazing and lacking other significant settlements in a buffer of about 1 kilometer. But this needs to be confirmed by paleo-environmental analysis. Above all, the sanctuary stood along a branch road of the Via Salaria, at the crossroads with the valley floor path of the Aso Valley that went up to the Sibillini Mountains, called Montes Romani, because they had not been assigned to private landowners, but it was Rome itself that left them for community use for grazing. The existence of areas left uncultivated for grazing, called saltus, in the territory around Fermo is mentioned by the Latin poet Catullus. So the sanctuary stood in a landscape dominated by pasture and forest rather than cultivated fields, with a marketplace along one of the seasonal transhumance routes between the coastal hills and the inland mountains. There are no houses around the sanctuary, but at this place, Roman citizens who lived scattered in the surrounding area must have gathered, recognizing themselves in common cults that consolidated their cultural identity and marked the seasons and the crucial passing moments that fortified social ties. We don't know exactly what the community gathered around Monte Rinaldo was, but we can assume that it was one of those rural districts called Pagi, typical of the Roman rural population. According to a very interesting hypothesis by Filippo Demma, in the case of Monte Rinaldo, It could be a community of Roman citizens originating from the Umbrian city of Spoleto because of this inscription that you can read here. As at Suasa is not housing, but the public buildings necessary for the life of a rural community that characterize these sites. Like Civitalba, Monte Rinaldo was also abandoned when the neighboring towns became the new central places in the territory. But until then, the sanctuary of Jupiter in the middle Aso Valley was the closest reality to the idea of Rome that settlers could find. A few decades later, a rural structure functional to a villa would be built on the now deconsecrated site. Its walls were built by reusing the remains of the Republican sanctuary, and the owner was probably a veteran of the Battle of Philippi in Macedonia. But this is another story. Don't worry, I don't want to tell you. However, if you let your eyes wander among the hills of the Aso Valley today, it is impossible not to stand in admiration at the columns that mark the remains of the ancient home of Jupiter and Hercules in the heart of the Picenum region. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you, Enrico. I must say before I open the floor to any questions, so don't run away. It's been a pleasure for the BSR to be involved in this project over the years, and also listen to the talk this evening, and also the work which has been done by the many students who have been involved in the projects over the years. Seeing some of the work there is fantastic. So as I said, it's a great pleasure for us to be involved in this project. There is an opportunity now for those of you here with us in Rome on this rather wet evening to ask Enrico a few questions if he wants to rejoin me on the stage. Yeah, I could try to answer them, but I suspect I might get them wrong. But for those of you here at the BSR, there is Pepe here who has a microphone, so please use a microphone if you have any questions. So those of people online can follow as well. And then those of you online as well, please do feel free to use the question and answer function at the bottom of your screen, and I will relay any of your questions to Enrico. But as a moderator, and as I think as is my privilege as ever, I can begin by asking a couple of questions about this work here. One of which I think arises a little bit from my own research I've been doing in terms of looking at these forms of different forms of settlement, and I'm intrigued. I've been intrigued by our work here. Particularly, I've seen Monte Rinaldo as this center place within the valley, as I think you were saying that there's been no within the valley itself, the Aso Valley, that no town has been recognized. Is there any other settlement in the valley which has been recorded by your work?
So we have to distinguish between the first phase of settlement in the Republican age, shortly after conquest, between the 3rd and the 2nd century BC, and the 1st century BC or the Imperial Age. There is a difference because in the beginning, really, actually, Monte Rinaldo was the only central place in the Aso Valley. We know that then at the mouth of the Aso River, near the mouth of the Aso River, we built a new town, the municipium of Cupra. But this municipium will flourish after Monte Rinaldo. And now there are some working ongoing by the University Orientale, University of Napoli Orientale. It was a work begun by Fabrizio Pesano. And there is really another towns, but we are not sure if is in the Aso Valley or in the neighboring. The name is Novana, which is a town abandoned in Roman time, in between maybe the fourth, during the Roman time, at the end of the Roman town. Some people, some scholars thought that we have to identify, speculate that probably is near the mountain. So maybe we can have a town which is Novana near the mountain, and another near the sea, which is Cupra, but only by the end of Republican age. So when Monte Rinaldo was abandoned. So there is something like first the sanctuary was the central place, and then many other places took the place of the central place, like in Civitanova.
And are there any parallels to this elsewhere on the Adriatic coast? Is this a single example?
I think that, but we need more information. The best parallel is Civitanova with this case. Okay, we have many other places, many other sanctuaries. We have other sanctuaries in the mid-Adriatic area between the south part of Marche region and north side of today Abruzzo region. So between the area of ancient Picenum, Peligni, but the history are different. In some cases, you have sanctuaries like Monte Rinaldo, which were abandoned when the towns flourished. But there are other cases where, in some cases, the sanctuary was used after.
Okay. We have. I'll take one question online. It's in Italian. I'll read in Italian. I can translate it. Complimenti per questa meravigliosa presentazione. Avrei una domanda circa la tabene del portico. In base a quali elementi avete identificato gli ambienti come tabene? Grazie, complimenti.
But really, risponde in italiano?
Probably if you don't mind, in English.
Okay.
So essentially the question is, I'm asking about the identification, how he became to identify some of the rooms on the portico as tabene.
But this is this is a point. not a strong identification. The idea is founded just by the plane, just because we have many little rooms in one after another. So usually these kind of rooms are interpreted as taberne in the portico. So just this. But you have to know that we have just the pediment of the room, so we have no walls.
Okay, so you have just the foundations.
Yeah, just foundation, and then this is an old excavation, so we have not too much material.
Yes, no. As Enrico was saying, obviously there was a lot of there's work at the site in the 1950s, which I think has obviously compromised a little bit some of their later work because of the clearance which is done by you saw in some of those pictures of raising those columns and kind of the kind of work they were doing there to kind of redo that, obviously compromise some of the archaeological stratigraphy and obviously some of the tabene, which makes the kind of that later process, those new excavations done by Enrico and his team more complicated. But I mean, it's a compliment to your work that you're able to identify some of these things as well. Are there any questions in the room? Who would like to, any further questions in the room here? Happy.
Maybe it's a silly question, but it's a minor problem. But the inscription Iovi Sacrum Spol, which type of object is, because my first idea is not spoliatium but spoil.
Yeah, this is this is just one idea, one hypothesis by Filippo Demma, but Filippo say that you really actually you can have other interpretation. One is a spoil. It is probably the main interpretation that we have. So this is another hypothesis, but just an hypothesis. So it's interesting because we know that in other sanctuaries in the north side of Abruzzo, we have some epigraphs about the name of the pagus of the sanctuary. So this is interesting, but because maybe there was a pagus, this was a sanctuary of a pagus also in Monte Rinaldo, but we have no another epigraphy like this. I mean, maybe you are right. So. Please.
Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. And I loved the second to last image of the spolia of the antefixes in the house. But my question is from my own ignorance of the in relation to the votives. You showed Jupiter and Hercules, but also Apollo and Vesta. And I was just wondering how common a practice was that in sanctuaries to have votives to not minor deities, but those who are not the main deity of the sanctuary. Is that common in the area? Is that, sorry, is my question not clear?
No.
It was just, is it common to find dedications to other deities in a sanctuary dedicated to Jupiter, for example? So the Apollo and the Vesta.
See, just a moment. We are trying to find the just the right picture. So yes, it is. You so usually yes, yeah. So really, usually you have the main deities. In this case, is Jupiter, and other deities in the same sanctuary. I don't. If you have many examples in Rome. The best temple of Rome was for 3 deities, no? And this was a place where probably they had to put together deities from Latin settlers and the people who lived there before. So some of these, like Hercules, were particularly adapted for this kind of landscape. It's not really so easy because usually Picenian people worship the female deities. Such as Cupra or Ancaria, we say. But surely they had to adapt. But surely Hercules was something that could work. The idea of the 2 shrines, so one, the smaller for Hercules, and the biggest with the house of Jupiter and maybe other deities, as we said, is just because of the size of the statue. Excuse me if I know.
Yeah, please.
Thank you. I have a question about settlement dynamics in the region. Early in the presentation, you showed a slide with a map and this kind of rural infill along the valley with lots of new sites. What is happening in the uplands, in the kind of higher elevations and more mountainous regions? And what, is there change? Is there not change? And what is this telling us perhaps about the pastoral economy in some of these more places more distant from these main roads and arteries of transport?
So thank you. This is really another interesting question. So thank you to all of you. So obviously it's not so easy to have an answer because of the kind of landscape, but I think that you know that. So we are trying to, we began to work, we began from the happening side, really, because we have many information by Latin authors. No? We know that there were this mountain called Romani, Montes Romani, and we know that this place was used for saltus, which is a kind of economy typical of the inland. And we have many information from grammatic sources in the late Roman age, where the emperor sent them here a grammatic to solve a problem of property, because there was a landowner who took the land of the community. But all this information comes from Latin authors. We have a problem with archaeology. So we we tried to have a kind of survey, but you can understand that is not a place useful for survey. So now we are trying to have a new project to solve this problem using more remote sensing or power environmental analysis to understand better. Because we, for example, near the Montes Romani, in the middle of the Montes Romani, and a little bit on the west, there is Nursia, which is an important town in this area. So surely this is something really important for the economy of these lands. But we have to work in another way, using another kind of landscape archaeology, which is an upland archaeology, probably.
Ask another question.
Yeah, no, please go ahead.
I have another question too. Can I ask about your very interesting circular foundation pit? Because it's a very striking shape. And could you say a few more words about it? Is it flat on the bottom? Could it have been associated with something? Because it makes me think of a silo almost, looking at that very round shape in the corner. It'd just be interesting to, and we have something very similar at a site I work on, so I'm interested in hearing your thoughts.
I was very, it was a good period for me to work there, because I was working there with many colleagues and that they were really better than mine. So between them, among them, there was Francesco Belfiori. Now is in superintendenza, but at the time he's working with us at the University of Bologna. He's a scholar who is studying this topic, so the problem of the archaeology of cult. So he could recognize this, not so when we were excavating in this area, we could find these strange circular pits, and then we could go down. And so this is really a hole in front of the wall, the pediment of the wall, where we could find this kind of ceramics. Really, usually we find this, not only this. Usually we could find capped, but put up down, and animal bones burnt, and sometimes iron knife. So really something linked with a sacrifice, something like this. But this is not about the cult. This is something related to the building. You can find something, and you know, something like this in a house, maybe not only in a sanctuary. And the other part is because we can understand that probably in the old excavation, they could find something similar, but they couldn't recognize. But we could put together the information, and we are thinking that probably there were other places like this. One, this is our to find, and this is the other. I don't know if I answer.
I don't think there's any more online, was there? No, I think we've answered it. So unless there's any more questions from those of you online, who again, I thank you for joining us here this evening in Rome. And thank you all of those of you here at the Peer School for joining us this evening. Again, my thanks to Enrico, not just for this evening's lecture, but for his continuing collaboration with the British School at Rome, and to the Comune of Monte Rinaldo, who's supported so enthusiastically this work over the last 7 or 8 years. So finally, let us finally thank Enrico once again, and I obviously invite all of you here upstairs for refreshment to feel free to ask Enrico any further questions. So thank you very much.